When the Pacific War erupted in 1941, the United States Navy faced a terrifying reality. The Japanese Empire had the largest and most experienced carrier force on the planet. Their elite air crews, their fast carriers, and their shockingly coordinated tactics crushed Allied bases across the Pacific in a storm of fire. Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. Japan's carriers moved like a hammer, striking at will, and for months it seemed like no nation could stand against them. But deep within American shipyards, something extraordinary was already taking shape. Something larger, tougher, and more numerous than anything the Japanese Navy had ever imagined. These ships would become the backbone of the greatest naval buildup in human history. They were the Essex-Class fleet carriers. The story of how these massive carriers overwhelmed Japan begins long before they ever sailed into battle. In 1939, even before the war began, the United States quietly predicted that aircraft carriers would dominate the next major conflict. Naval engineers and strategists studied the lessons from early carrier operations and came to a bold conclusion. America needed carriers that were bigger, stronger, and capable of sustaining long, brutal campaigns across vast oceans. The result was the Essex-Class, ships far more powerful than the previous Yorktown class. They were built with armored hangars, massive flight decks, heavy anti-aircraft firepower, multiple aircraft elevators, and the ability to launch and recover planes faster than any carrier before them. But the true power of the Essex-Class wasn't found in a single ship. It was in the scale. The United States planned something unprecedented, mass-producing 24 fleet carriers in just a few years. No other nation had ever attempted anything like this, not even close. For Japan, which struggled to replace even a handful of carriers, this industrial avalanche would become a nightmare they never saw coming. As the war expanded and the battle for the Pacific intensified, American shipyards roared to life. Workers labored day and night, men and women, welders and riveters, engineers and machinists, turning steel and determination into unstoppable warships. Each Essex carrier required tens of thousands of tons of steel, millions of parts, and a vast network of factories supplying engines, aircraft, ammunition, and fuel. Yet America's industrial capacity was so enormous that these ships seemed to roll off the slipways almost effortlessly. By 1943, the first Essex carriers reached the front lines. The Japanese Navy had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, Japan struggled desperately to keep up. Their shipyards were small, slow, and constantly starved of steel, oil, and trained workers. Their carriers were excellent designs, but they could not be produced quickly. Worse, every ship Japan lost at Midway or in early battles could not be replaced. The United States, however, replaced losses faster than anyone thought possible. America didn't just match Japan's carrier force, they multiplied it several times over. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-Class carriers had been launched. That number alone represented more carriers than the entire world possessed in 1941. The Essex carriers were not just numerous, they were deadly. Each one could carry nearly 100 aircraft, supported by thousands of sailors, mechanics, and pilots. Their air wings included F-6F Hellcats, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBF Avengers, aircraft that outperformed Japan's fighters and bombers in almost every category. These planes flew farther, climbed higher, and fought harder than anything Japan could put in the air after 1943. And with each Essex that entered service, the skies over the Pacific became more dangerous for Japanese pilots. In early 1944, Japan began to notice something disturbing. American carriers were attacking from multiple directions, far more carriers than Japan believed possible. Air raids on the Marshall Islands, the Gilberts, and the Marianas came with astonishing force. Japanese pilots returning to their bases reported waves of American aircraft unlike anything they had seen before. Where once they had fought 1 or 2 carriers, now they faced task groups of 4, 6, or even 8 carriers operating together in massive formations. It was overwhelming. As the Essex carriers multiplied, American strategy evolved. Instead of cautiously advancing island by island, the U.S. Navy formed fast carrier task forces capable of attacking with a level of mobility and firepower that no navy in history had matched. These groups could launch hundreds of aircraft in minutes, tearing apart Japanese fleets, airfields, and supply lines before Japan could respond. For Japanese commanders, it was like watching a tidal wave rise out of nowhere. The turning point came during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American radar, fighter direction, and the incredible durability of aircraft like the Hellcat allowed the Essex carriers to wipe out nearly all remaining experienced Japanese pilots. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft in a single day, losses they could never replace. The Essex carriers had become flying fortresses, immune to most Japanese counterattacks and capable of sustaining operations for weeks without rest. Even more devastating was the fact that every time Japan expected American forces to slow down, more Essex carriers arrived. Every few months, fresh carriers joined the fight, fully armed and staffed with new air wings. Japan watched in disbelief as America's carrier fleet doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled. The Essex-Class wasn't just participating in the war, they were overwhelming it. By late 1944, the Essex Force had become the heart of Task Force 38, the most powerful naval aviation group ever assembled. Its combined air wings launched thousands of sorties per week. Japanese bases, convoys, and fleets stood no chance. As American troops advanced through the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Essex carriers provided relentless air support. Their aircraft destroyed shipping, bombed airfields, hunted submarines, and dominated the skies in every major battle. For the Japanese Navy, the Essex carriers were a nightmare that only grew larger with time. Even kamikaze attacks, which Japan hoped would turn the tide, could not stop them. The carriers were so well armored and so well defended by escorts that most kamikazes failed to cause significant damage. And even when a carrier was hit, it was repaired and returned to action astonishingly quickly. By the time the war reached its final months, Japan's naval aviation had collapsed entirely. They had lost their best pilots, their best ships, their best aircraft, and their ability to rebuild. Meanwhile, the Essex carriers continued to arrive, forming an unstoppable wall of steel, planes, and firepower. They attacked Japanese cities, ships, and factories with devastating effect. Part 1 ends as the war enters its final phase, the moment when the Essex carriers become the driving force behind the destruction of Japan's remaining naval power and the fall of the empire itself. As 1944 progressed, the Essex carriers became the unstoppable spearhead of American power in the Pacific. Their flight decks launched wave after wave of aircraft that systematically broke the backbone of Japanese naval and air resistance. Every island assaulted, every enemy base struck, and every sea lane contested saw the silhouette of an Essex-Class carrier standing in the background like an enormous steel guardian. By the time the Mariana Islands came under American assault, Japan faced an air power crisis. Their pilots were undertrained, their aircraft increasingly outdated, and their fuel supply critically low. Yet the Essex carriers arrived with air groups that were larger, more modern, and maintained by crews whose operational efficiency had reached near mechanical perfection. Every launch was coordinated, every recovery rehearsed, every refuel and rearm cycle executed with breathtaking speed. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Japanese Navy attempted to halt the American advance with one last massive strike. But the Essex carriers did not flinch. Their radar-guided combat air patrol intercepted wave after wave of Japanese planes long before they reached the U.S. fleet. The result became infamous as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a devastating demonstration that the age of Japanese naval air power had ended. American fighters, especially the Hellcats launched from Essex decks, tore through Japanese formations with overwhelming advantage. By dusk, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. The Essex-Class carriers were now not only platforms of attack, they were floating fortresses dictating the tempo of the war. As American forces pushed closer toward the Japanese homeland, the Essex carriers adapted to every new challenge. They struck oil refineries, aircraft factories, shipyards, air bases, and supply depots across Formosa, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Their long operational range allowed them to hit targets thought unreachable only a year earlier. Japan, already strained, could not rebuild, replace, or resist with equal strength. The Philippine campaign highlighted the Essex carriers' endurance. For months at a time, they rotated between offensive strikes, scouting missions, anti-submarine patrols, and close air support. With multiple carriers operating side by side, one could launch its aircraft while another recovered, ensuring that the sky above American forces was never empty. This persistent pressure wore down Japanese defenses day after day. As the war approached the Japanese mainland, the enemy introduced kamikaze operations in a desperate attempt to counter American naval forces. Although the kamikazes inflicted painful damage, the Essex carriers proved far more resilient than expected. Their armored flight decks, excellent firefighting crews, and advanced damage control systems ensured that even when struck, they often returned to duty far faster than predicted. Some carriers survived multiple direct hits and still continued launching aircraft within hours. Each attack only highlighted the durability and ingenuity built into the Essex design. In 1945, the Essex carriers began launching deep penetration strikes over Japan itself. They targeted communication centers, industrial zones, port facilities, and military headquarters, grinding down the last remnants of Japan's war machine. Their aircraft crippled Japanese shipping, shattered rail lines, and destroyed aircraft production facilities that Japan desperately depended upon. Every mission shortened the war. The carriers also played a key role in suppressing Japanese airfields, preventing fighters from intercepting the B-29 bombers that were beginning their strategic bombing missions. Without the Essex carriers maintaining constant pressure, Japan might have mustered a stronger defensive response. But against 24 powerful carriers rotating through the Pacific, resistance collapsed piece by piece. By mid-1945, the Essex fleet had become the most formidable carrier group the world had ever seen. Each ship carried hundreds of aircraft, thousands of sailors, and enough firepower to influence entire regions. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most feared naval aviation force in the world, was now unable to challenge them. When American forces approached Okinawa, more than a dozen Essex carriers formed the air umbrella that shielded troop transports, defended the fleet, and pulverized Japanese defensive positions on the island. Their aircraft flew thousands of sorties per week, maintaining constant air superiority. Despite relentless kamikaze attacks, the carriers continued their operations without interruption. Damaged ships were repaired, reinforced, and restored to the fight with astonishing speed. The Japanese command noted with disbelief that the American carriers simply could not be removed from the battlefield. As summer arrived, the Essex carriers launched raids directly over Tokyo, Yokosuka, and other major military targets across Japan. They destroyed ships trapped in port, smashed hangars and airfields, and dismantled Japan's remaining naval aviation assets. The psychological impact on Japan's leadership was profound. Their homeland was under continuous attack from a fleet that had no equivalent and no weakness to exploit. By the time Japan surrendered, the Essex carriers had rewritten naval warfare. They had proven that a fleet of fast, heavily armed, and industriously produced carriers could dominate every dimension of the war. Their combination of firepower, durability, and strategic mobility overwhelmed a nation already stretched to its limits. The 24 Essex carriers launched during World War II transformed the Pacific War from a series of isolated island battles into a massive, coordinated offensive that no enemy could resist. They were the floating airfields that brought American air power to every corner of the Pacific. They allowed the U.S. to strike anywhere, anytime, with precision and force. After the war, the Essex carriers continued serving for decades, reinforcing their reputation as some of the greatest warships ever built. The 24 Essex carriers launched during World War II transformed the Pacific War from a series of isolated island battles into a massive, coordinated offensive that no enemy could resist. They were the floating airfields that brought American air power to every corner of the Pacific. They allowed the U.S. to strike anywhere, anytime, with precision and force. After the war, the Essex carriers continued serving for decades, reinforcing their reputation as some of the greatest warships ever built. But their legacy was forged in the crucible of World War II, where they reshaped naval history and became the ultimate symbol of American industrial might and operational dominance. The Japanese command never found a way to counter them. Their pilots could not outfight the American air groups, their ships could not outrun the American raids, their defenses could not withstand the constant waves of attacks. In the end, the Essex carriers did not just participate in the war, they defined it, and they remain a stark reminder of how overwhelming industrial power, innovative engineering, and disciplined training can change the outcome of global conflict. The Essex carriers did not simply overwhelm Japan, they helped end the war itself.